When I say Mount Everest, what word comes to mind? Adventure? Arduous? Eccentricity, perhaps? Ego? What about bucket list? For many, Mount Everest is synonymous with epic achievement. Many dream of Mount Everest, and each year, approximately 100,000 people visit the national park below. A fair portion of those try to make it to Everest Base Camp, and about 800 each year try to reach the summit. But since 1953, just 6,664 had been successful at reaching the top. That is, until mid-May of this year. As of mid-May, Israeli high-tech entrepreneur Ron Kraus is now among them. There are, if you follow his Instagram, heart-stopping photos of him hanging from a rope from a mountain face of sheer ice. It's enough to make any Jewish mother's heart stop. And there are frost-swept shots of him at the peak, Israeli flag billowing between his proudly stretched hands in a way that lifts the spirit. But unlike the words that usually come to mind when we think of a Mount Everest trek, Kraus chose to define his climb by a very different word: memory. Reaching the summit after a 6-week grueling ascent, he dedicated his climb to Matan Lior, who was brutally murdered on October 7th at the Nova Festival massacre. Matan was at the soundboard when the festival was attacked. As his mother, Sarah, shared, at some point he understood what was going on there, and he saved almost 100 lives. Using his sound equipment, she said, he shouted at people to leave until he had no voice left. And then he started to collect people who were frozen, who were confused and didn't know what to do. He ran, she said, and threw people into bushes and fields. He saved his girlfriend. So many people, she said, told us that he was a hero. And so, as Ron Kraus summited Mount Everest, it was not just his own achievement that he was focused on. He said, "I dedicate this exciting moment to my late friend, Matan Mordechai Lior, who was brutally murdered while bravely assisting many others and saving many lives. My personal victory," he said, "is a victory for the human spirit and the Israeli spirit." As he was climbing, it turns out, there was another group hiking to base camp below. There, they unfurled a Torah and lifted it high, tagging the photographs that they took there, praying for the hostages at the highest point. Hashtag bring them home. What do we make of climbing Mount Everest, carrying such searing memory, of bringing the Torah to the highest peak? For those of us who are not mountain climbers, what do these climbers have to teach us? It turns out so very much. Ron Krause's spirit sets for us an alternative trajectory for each and every one of us, because in the midst of his profound loss and grief, instead of sinking into intractable pain, he decided to impose a challenge on himself that was both physical and spiritual. The physical part is obvious, but the spiritual part he describes as cultivating humility in the face of something daunting, as patience for what he calls the boredom of training step after step, and the internal journey, as important as the external one, to hurl himself into something that could have been all about him and understand it as so much more. The fire that fueled him up the rocks and the ice was the fire of memory, of legacy, of love, of responsibility to excavate the biggest and the best that he had inside, because up the literal mountain and up the mountain of the rest of his life, he is carrying Matan too. As Matan's girlfriend, Zohar Ma'aravi, put it, life is stronger than anything. We're here to keep living and giving it our all. That is what Matan would have wanted. That spirit calls out to each of us right now. We may not be mountain climbers, but we all have the challenge of channeling our grief into good, our pain into purpose, lifting it and ourselves to a higher place. Rabbi Stephen Weiss understands the opening words of our parsha this morning, Im bechukotai telechu, if in my laws you will go, as a recipe for that endeavor. He reads it through the lens of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who teaches that the Hebrew word telechu, you shall go, which also means walk, is actually a charge to every one of us every day to summon the strength to walk with purpose. One who does this, he says, lifts to a higher spiritual level than they had the day before. It seems that everywhere we look today, there's heartbreak, loss, chaos, reasons to fear. Ron Krause could climb Mount Everest. How do we get ourselves to a higher place? By borrowing his secret sauce, devoting ourselves to someone or something bigger than ourselves. I want to tell you a story that you won't see in the papers. You know, we all see the alarming rise in anti-Semitism in the news, on social media, for some of us in our workplaces or our friendship circles. A member of our shul who's a therapist recently sent me a grim article about Jewish therapists being shunned or doxxed for their Zionism, real or assumed, which could just have easily been written about Jewish students on campus or Jewish artists whose work is not able to be shown, or authors whose books are not welcome. That story we know. But did you know that since October 7th, here at Temple Emmanuel, we have a record number of people choosing to become Jews? In this past month alone, we have had 5 conversions, with 4 more scheduled between now and Shavuot. In just one day, last week, 3 additional people called the shul to begin the process. And so with all these conversions, when we reached out to Mayim Chaim, to our local mikveh to try to schedule, the mikveh coordinator replied, scheduling is really tricky. And she said, we've had more conversions in the past 5 months than in the last 15 years. Our regular immersions, she added, have also increased too. In other words, this is a moment that people are choosing in record numbers to devote themselves to more deeply living Jewish lives. How do we understand this? Well, every one of them has spoken about the driving need, especially in this time, to align themselves with a people and a purpose beyond themselves. What's more, these conversions are unfailingly emotional. Unlike some in the past who just came with the joy of being a Jew, these converts know exactly what they're getting into, and they do it with deepest emotion. One man reflected that in a world that feels it has lost its compass, our ancestors' stories are a place where he sees a map to make it through. A young woman wept as we met with her for her Beit Din. We asked her, tell us about these tears. And she said, my husband served years ago in the IDF. The unit that he served with is now back in Gaza. There has been so much devastation. I join the Jewish people to join my life to theirs. Another woman shared how her grandmother, on her father's side in South America, would never serve ham sandwiches. In a world in which it was not safe to be a Jew, this woman saw in that her grandmother's courage to preserve practice until it could be articulated in another generation. In the turning now of her own social circle, she felt called. She felt she has a role to play in telling our people's story. It's time, she said, for me to return our family home. These are their stories. But what about yours? I invite you today to ask yourself, what is your Mount Everest? What will you carry with you as you climb? It could be shul, or service, or commitment to a cause, a memory, or connection with those you hold most dear. In this time of trouble, what will you choose to carry that will lift you higher? Shabbat Shalom.